People often say that watercolour is unpredictable, and sometimes it is. But the more you find out about the ingredients in the watercolour paints and how they behave, the less of a surprise that becomes, and the more you can use that unpredictable nature of watercolour to your advantage. So today I wanted to talk about how to understand the labels on the watercolour and the properties of the paint, but I thought that if I just sat here and talked to you about that might be a bit dull, so perhaps I should paint something and I'll talk to you about those watercolour paint properties while we watch me painting something from my photo memories, as I like to call them. Idea of the photo memories, I've got another video that talks about that in a bit more detail, so I'll link to that in the top corner of this video and of course put a link in the description. What you're watching me sketch out now is a beach holiday scene. It's my daughter jumping in the waves. One of my favourite properties of watercolour paint is transparency. The bright colours are laid like a sheer veil over the paper, letting the white of the page glow through. Paints can be layered in the same or different colours, and when they're transparent, you will see the underneath layer through the top layer. This means you can achieve colour mixing without actually mixing the paint. And you're going to see me do this with the picture of my little girl, because I start with a colour called burnt sienna, and I am just using more water to get a paler flesh tone out of the burnt sienna and using it more concentrated to get the shadow sides, the shadow colours. And then later on you'll see me add a purple to give it a bit more depth in those shadow areas. So the purple mixes with the skin colour without me having to actually mix that in my palette effectively. Now I prefer the transparent colours, so I don't actually have a lot of opaque colours in my paint box. One of the ones I do have is in fact a flesh tone. It's called Naples Red Yellow, and I do use that occasionally, but you can see here I've opted to just use watered down burnt sienna to get the same effect as I would from that pale Naples Yellow Red, because I don't really like the chalkiness of the opaque paints. If you do like that, you might find you like gouache, and you might want to look into that to expand your repertoire a bit. So apart from transparency, one of the other things that you notice about some colours in your paint box is what they call granulation. And granulation you can see in my sky in this picture, because ultramarine blue is a colour that typically is a granulating colour. What that means is when I'm laying down that sky wash, it won't end up being a perfectly smooth flat wash. There will be a little bit of variation, which can be quite interesting. I don't love it in the sky, but it's quite subtle if you're careful with it. I do love that granulation in the sea, however. Reds and pinks are often colours that are not as light fast as the others, which is one of the other important properties of watercolour that you might want to know about. What they're talking about there is that over time, as the painting is exposed to light, some of the colours might deteriorate. If they have a low light fast rating, then those are going to be colours that are going to fade and not look as good over time. Opera Rose by Daniel Smith, it's not a colour I have that brilliant red violet, which kind of is good enough for me, but Opera Rose is a similar one that everybody seems to love, but it is one of these lower light fast rating colours, which is sometimes called a fugitive colour, meaning it's kind of temporary. So it's going to look beautiful today when you paint it, but in a couple of years it might not. So if you're just painting for pleasure, go right ahead and use it, but if you're painting something that's going to be a gift or something that you might want to try and sell, you might want to try and avoid those fugitive or light fast, non-light fast colours. And in the sea I'm using another granulating colour which is called Cascade Green, and that's by Daniel Smith, and that's another one of my absolute favourites. And there I'm using the paint to give so much more life and energy to the sea without me really having to do it. It's really because of the qualities of the paint itself. So if you get used to reading the labels, you'll know in advance whether that particular colour is going to behave in such a fashion for you. Another property that is usually described either on the colour chart from the paint manufacturer or perhaps on the tube itself is staining or non-staining. And one of the most staining colours in my paint box is that colour called Brilliant Red Violet, which I'm very fond of, you may have noticed, and you'll see me putting it into my painting probably more than I should. Although I never like to use the word should, because I think you should just paint with the colours you like. And sometimes that's the things we like most about somebody's painting, is that they've put in the colours that they can see or that they would like to see. And that's brought extra life and interest to the scene that benefits the painting. But that colour, Brilliant Red Violet, is the colour I'm using to shade part of my daughter's clothing there, her little rashy top, and I have echoed that colour in the sand and I put it into the waves, which is probably where I should have stopped because it's better to keep your shadows a little bit more on the cool side. But the point about a staining colour is, while most watercolours you should be able to lift out while they're still damp, which means that when the paint is still wet, you can blot it and lift that out. If it's a staining colour, you will have a bit more difficulty doing that, and the red violet is one of those. So when I paint the waves, you can see that happening a little bit, where I'm blotting but some of the colour remains, and it happens with one of the greens that I've used, and it happens with the violet colour as well. And if you could see my art table, you would see what I mean about the staining, because my art table used to be white and now it's got these rather persistent red violet splatters, but I'm okay with that. I'm not a total neat freak, so I will just live with that because I love that brilliant red violet so much. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe and comment. And if you were wanting to learn a little bit more about how to use watercolour tubes and pans and all about the properties of watercolour paints, then there's an extensive blog post that goes along with this video. I'll link to that in the description below. See you next time. Happy painting!